It's one thing to listen to doom and gloom about food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation. It's quite another thing to hear practical, immediately actionable advice from experts who can help you reduce the fear, anxiety, and burden of these problems. Tune in now to the Surviving Hard Times podcast from the Finding Genius Foundation with Richard Jacobs. Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out, and I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now to our guest. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Surviving Hard Times podcast, sponsored by the Finding Genius Foundation.
My guest is Dr. Ted McAvoy. He's at the University of Georgia. He's an assistant professor of horticulture. He's a vegetable extension specialist. So we're going to talk about vegetable production, irrigation, and some alternate crops that may be in the works. So Ted, thanks for coming.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background briefly, and then what got you interested in horticulture, and then we'll talk about your current work.
Well, all my degrees, bachelor's, master's, and PhD are in horticulture. I've always specialized in vegetables, whether it was weed control, fumigants, or variety trials. I think just prior to coming to University of Georgia, I did variety trials. I was with Syngenta vegetable seeds doing field trials in Florida and Georgia, and sometimes even in New Jersey. So all up the East Coast. Start out with large seeded vegetables, sweet corn and green beans, and I went over to solanaceous crops, pepper and tomato. So since I've been in Georgia, I've been trying to focus on variety trials, fertilizer management, irrigation, cover crops, and soil amendments.
Okay. Well, let's start with what are variety trials? What does that mean?
So with any given crop, there's different genetics. So, let's say tomatoes, there might be, and I'm using the words cultivar and variety interchangeably, but it's variations within the plant that has certain traits and characteristics. So, we're evaluating them for performance, for yield, fruit size, color, shape, sugars, any differences, and just general adaptability to our area.
Okay, got it. So, all right, so we know what the varieties are. I don't know, what are you working with certain plants to try to optimize, again, or minimize the use of pesticides or fumigants, or like what are some of what are some of the particular experiments you're doing and why?
No problem. So in Georgia, I've been trying to focus on the major crops, which are Vidalia onion, sweet corn, bell pepper, and watermelon. And being an extension specialist, which is what I am, I'm majority extension. So I try to do trials that growers are having problems with. So I'm trying to find the better performing varieties that do well. Input costs are a big problem. So some of the soil amendments, with chicken litter, for example, are trying to use waste products from the poultry industry that are cheaper than synthetic fertilizers, so to see if we could save money and increase yields, or at least maintain yields. So I think some of the biggest issues we're having are labor and disease. Now, we do have other faculty that are pathologists, so they do work more on diseases than I do. But, I like being just a general vegetable specialist. I get to work with other faculty and collaborate. And so I've been doing a lot of trials with anthracnose management to see if there's varietal differences and if irrigation management can help with disease on watermelons. And there's a new precision ag specialist, Luan Oliveira. I've been trying to do machine transplanting and machine sprayers, drones, unmanned robotics, to try to figure out if we could have alternatives to the labor dependence.
Okay. Are you noticing that? I mean, is it an arms race? The pests and conditions are always changing, so that you always have to change strategy, or if you come up with the right mixture of fumigants or pesticides, et cetera, that things are pretty stable year to year. Like, how much variation is there, and how hard is it to continually get a good yield on the crops that are grown?
I would say it's an arms race, and it's probably a battle that's been going on as long as time, but it's not every day, so definitely genetics would be the number one. If you could get a plant that is resistant to a disease, that's usually a stronger method of resistance than chemical resistance, and it's longer lasting typically. Chemically, some pests seem for whatever reason that they develop resistance faster and more easily, while others it seems not to be an issue historically with certain pests. Whitefly, for example, they're always mutating and becoming resistant. Diamondback moth, same story.
Well, if you have a field of crops, are there certain crops that don't seem to be affected by a given pest? Even if like 99% of all the other ones are, and could you selectively breed the ones, if so, that are more naturally resistant?
Yes, sir. And so I'm not a breeder. I select for the horticultural characteristics. So if a breeder gives me material, whether it's breeding material or commercially available, we can select to see if it holds up to the diseases in our area, the strains. And yes, absolutely. That's the idea. And, we do have a new pepper breeder here at University of Georgia. We have a cucurbit breeder, and, so we're working on breeding and selecting for resistance.
Once you have a protocol dialed in for a particular, plant or plants, how local will that protocol be effective? Like, if I have a field in, I don't know, southern Atlanta, will it still work in the same conditions in Macon or the rest of Georgia? Or like how specific and how local does your protocol have to be to protect certain plants?
So it has to be tested everywhere where you want to grow. And there's no clear answer. So some things like, maybe the top performing corn obsession or, caprice historically, they're very well adapted and they work well across multiple seasons and geographical regions. And that makes a really stable, good variety. But having said that, so, in general, I would say if I'm selecting stuff in southern Georgia, it's good for southern Georgia, Alabama, North Florida. But there's a possibility that some things just seem very stable across the board, in different geographic areas. So that's what you really want to see, is something that's well adapted, could handle stress, has not only yield potential, but also yield stability.
Are there some crops that, again, once you've found a way to protect them, they're pretty stable, and other ones need like a different protocol every season? They seem to change a lot along with the predators and pests that affect them.
Right. So as far as vegetable crops, I'd say they're probably less hardy in general than agronomic crops. But, we have got the top performing varieties that are, material chemistries that are performing. And also, people know when, I'll say, when to hold them and when to fold them. And so, like watermelon in Georgia, beautiful spring crop. We're starting off cool and dry, and, we're not gonna get any disease come until end of May, June, so for a couple months, just no insects, no pests. But then in the fall, you can't grow a watermelon crop. We just know it. You're going to have downy mildew from the first one. It's hot from first day. It's hot. It's humid. It's raining all the time. There's a ton of white flies transmitting multiple viruses. So I think that's it. Is just that's what we do at the University of Georgia. Is we make recommendations. We trial it. We make recommendation, and I think there's stability. That's going to be a common trend. It's predictable of what you're going to encounter. So with corn, you're going to have corn earworm. You're going to have southern corn leaf blight. Southern corn leaf blight's going to be more severe in the fall than it is so I think it's seasonal and cyclical, and you might not know it's the day, but within like a 3-week period, it's almost pretty routine in that respect.
Yeah. So it's very predictable, but the players are adapting, and the old strategies may not work on the same players as before.
That's right. And there's certain things you can't control, like the weather. And so we have chemistries that can control disease, but if it rains for 2 weeks straight, you can't get out there and spray. It's flooded. Everything's washed off. It's not doing you any good. And you just can't do anything about that. Hail, etc. So I would say there's some certain things that are just outside your control, and you can't do anything about it.
What about the vernal variation of pests? So do some come only at night? Do some come in the day? What if you have a field where you can somehow, put a cover over it overnight? A certain bug attacks it at night, and the plants don't need sun then. Maybe you can cover the field and prevent the pests mechanically from coming in, until the morning. Just an example I made up, but
right.
Not the case.
So that's something that's ongoing. So one thing is honeybees, for example. So we use a lot of honeybees for pollination in vegetable crops. For things that need to get pollinated, like squash, watermelon, we bring in beehives, whether they're honeybees or bumblebees. And the same insecticides that typically will kill your pest will kill your bees. But we can avoid that by timing. So bees typically work in the morning. And if you're spraying at night or in the afternoon, you're not spraying your bees. For example, there's been some work with ultraviolet light, and I think just having light exposure at night can disrupt certain diseases. So I think that's things that people are doing, and even just the wind. If you could spray early in the morning or at night, you don't have as much wind, and you could reduce your drift possibility.
Well, if you spray in the morning and the sun is shining down on the crops all day, what about the ultraviolet radiation and everything? Would that alter the compounds that you've sprayed on the plants? Maybe create some alternative products that you might not be aware of that would have, good or bad action. Maybe maybe the sunlight hitting a particular, again, compound that's sensitive that would break it apart, and therefore it render it ineffective or more effective or too effective. Is there any observation on that happening?
Right. So as far as UV light, there's two scenarios I could think of. One is sometimes you can get phytotoxicity or chemical burn. So if you apply copper, for example, if you tank mix a lot of stuff that has the potential to burn, the sunlight exacerbates that burning, leaf burn. So that's one thing. And then the other is biologicals. So many times, and there's certain biologicals that are effective, but they're also more finicky. So a lot of times people might find a fungus that can infect an insect and kill it. So then they'll try to induce that on purpose, where they're spraying the fungus on plant leaf. And that is usually, a lot of times it's finicky. It might get too hot and that fungus will die. The sun will be too intense and that fungal will die. I'm using fungal. It could be virus, anything, biological. Biologicals, are typically have a temperature range, a humidity range, sunlight requirements that if everything's not right, it won't grow and thrive.
Okay. What are some of the new methods that are being experimented with? Maybe you're doing it, or you see it in the literature. Any new innovations coming that you think will be useful?
Yes. I think the most innovative thing I'm doing is I'm working with biochar and poultry litter. And biochar is charcoal essentially. And, with this testing it, but the idea is that it doesn't decompose in the soil like other forms of carbon, so it sequesters carbon, and it's a long-term additive instead of having to reapply. So cover crops, for example, break down after months, composts, whereas the biochar, they've used that with terra preta soils in Amazons, with native Amazon Indians. And even after thousands of years, they've noticed these soils are still more productive than the native soils. And what they were using was their burn fires. So they had charcoal, pottery chards, and kind of had like a man-made enhanced soil. And so the biochar is stable. So we're trying it with synthetic fertilizer and organic fertilizer, poultry litter. And the idea is, will it increase nutrient retention, water holding capacity, leading to increased plant growth and yields? And in particular with poultry litter, there's food safety concerns. So using animal manures, there's a rule where you have to apply at least 90 days before harvest for above ground portions of vegetables, or 120 days before below ground portion of the vegetable. So you can't just side dress like you would with a synthetic fertilizer because of food safety concerns. And the issue there is, you're concerned about putting all your nitrogen and everything even before you plant the crop, that by the time it's fruiting, there's not enough left to support that crop. So that's why we're trying to pair it with biochar to see if we could capture that nitrogen from leaching and be able to provide a longer, slower release.
Well, what's the role of biochar? Is it like biologically active? Does it contain beneficial microorganisms in it, or like what's its use? Does it help the soil become more porous where it's at and provide airspace? Like what is the reason for it?
Yes. So it changes the physical characteristics, like I said, water holding capacity, nutrient capacity, and sandier soils, probably porosity and thicker, more clay soils. It is inert, but it just changing the physical characteristics can lead to different microbial populations and conditions to cause shifts.
Okay.
But yeah, as far as just innovative stuff, there's GMO. Now there's stuff that's non-GMO, gene editing. So GMO would be a foreign organism being put into a separate species, where the gene editing is if that specific species has that gene in it, they can, and I don't understand it fully, but they could manipulate it so that gene is expressed,
and
it's not considered GMO. There's new plastic film mulches. So in vegetable crops for weed control, we'll cover with plastic mulch, and that increases water retention. It can manipulate the temperature of the soil. So we're using black plastics in early spring when it's cold to warm the soil. So we're using white plastics in the fall to reduce soil temperatures. We've been using, that's the standard. We've been using that a long time. Now they have this, again, the standard is totally impermeable film. They used to have low density polyethylene, high density polyethylene, virtually impermeable film, now totally impermeable film. And with a totally impermeable film, we could reduce fumigants, which are gas applied under the plastic to kill weeds and pests. We could reduce that, only applying approximately 20 to 30% of the fumigants we were applying prior, and getting similar control, just with
yeah, but wouldn't that create an anaerobic environment, around the stem of the plant?
That's before planting. Now we punch holes and where we plant into those holes.
Yeah, but still the localized soil around the, would be much more anaerobic than before. So would that lead to different bacteria than before that are taking up residence and change the profile of the soil and, the taste of the plants, et cetera?
I would say if you're overwatering it, definitely could probably get anaerobic easier. And I don't know if, that, could have microbial shifts and reduce root growth and things like that. But I don't know about changing the taste or anything of your fruits. I think what they're doing was they have paper mulch now. So, and again, the idea, so the problem with plastic mulch is disposal, right? It doesn't degrade. You have to pick it up, bring it to a landfill. You can recycle it because plastic is recyclable, but it's typically lower quality. It's maybe park benches or something, but not like food containers. So they're using paper mulch. And again, that idea has been around for a long time of paper mulches and mulches that degrade, and they've typically had issues, but there's a new one that's promising. That's all I'm getting at is, in the past, paper mulch, like we tried it when I was in grad school, and it was just like the brown rolls that you do for art projects. And that stuff ripped and it got wet and fell apart, and wasn't easy to work with. They have plastic mulches that are degradable, and, what you want is something to last your whole season, right? So, just like mulch at your house, it's the same thing. It blocks sunlight from entering the soil, preventing weed growth, conserving that moisture. If it degrades before your crop's done, then you got problems still. So you want it to last the whole time. So I think that's been a thing of the balance. So I've seen a new mulch that's paper mulch, and it's outperforming plastic mulch for nut sedge control, which is the biggest weed that we have in plastic culture because it just pushes right through the plastic. Most, seeds are inhibited by the mulch, but the nut sedge has tubers and and pointy leaf tips, so it could forcefully puncture the mulch. And this paper, research is full of surprises. If you had told me, I would have said, "Oh, I think it'd probably do worse," right? Like paper in general is a weak material.
So because of the chemical processing, or what reason?
I haven't worked with it, but Bob Hockmuth out of Florida has worked with it, and there's some news articles about it. I believe it's paper, and it's got a lining from the cellulose of sugar cane. So it's got like a cellulose layer that I guess that's supposed to be the secret. I don't know.
Okay. What happens when sunlight shines on this plastic covering, in the ground? Does it degrade it? I mean, what happens to it?
You talking about the paper mulch or just our traditional mulches that
both the traditional, because it's plastic, and then the paper.
Yeah, the traditional, it doesn't. We could reuse the mulch for up to 3 seasons. You could use it at maximum spring, fall, and winter, for example, the 3 seasons. And the new one I don't know about. But yeah, it's not a rapid degradation. And for a lot of high value crops like strawberries, they're just using the plastic ones in one crop, and it holds up just fine.
Okay, well, very good. So, what's the best way for people to get help from you, as an extension specialist, or to maybe ask questions or follow your work? Where can they go?
Yes, sir. So, my email is ted.mcavoy, MCAVOY, @uga.edu. You could always check out University of Georgia Horticulture, the faculty page. You could find me there. The University of Georgia Tifton campus faculty page. I don't know if I mentioned I'm at Tifton campus in Southern Georgia.
Okay.
On my faculty page, there's links to my UGA vegetables website, and I run that website. So we post variety results. We have links to other faculty, other things that have to do with agriculture. My lab website is South Georgia Vegetables, and that's so that it introduces you into the type of research I'm doing and introduce you to my team, technicians, postdocs, everybody. and then also links to my Google Scholar page that highlights the publication.
Okay. Very good. Well, excellent. Well, Ted, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Richard.
Before you stop listening, ask yourself, what are 1 or 2 useful things you heard on this podcast that can help you overcome food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation? Please like and subscribe and tell your friends and family about their Surviving Hard Times podcast. We're all going to need help now and in the near future.